Huge pleasure to be here. Thanks to Simon and Ryan and Joe for doing things. Justin, can you hear all right? And great to see you after many years. So there are many people in the room who know a lot about these passages and these ideas. I welcome all kinds of comments. One particular kind of comment, among others, that I would love to get guidance for as I craft the paper is the strategy of writing for a handbook. I take it that the people attending this talk have spent more time with these passages than maybe the main reader of the book. And so I'll maybe make short work of some things here that I might belabor more in the chapter. But I would love guidance on how to strike that balance, how to avoid wasting pages on things that have been said better already, and at the same time, how to give an account that will be approachable to people who are confronting this for the first time. The other question is how to approach what I guess they used to call in the creation evolution debate, whether I should teach the controversy. In this field, it's impossible to say anything uncontroversial. And yet it's tiresome to lay out all the possibilities and remain aloof. So I've tried something, but I'd welcome guidance on strategy. So I begin with these two passages, fairly well-known passages from Aristotle. Not coincidentally, both within striking distance of his big discussions of money. The first is the reference to the Delphian knife, which is some sort of a cheap multi-tool. Seems like in the past 100 years, not a single English language commentator has managed not to say it must be like a Swiss Army knife. The second, the so-called lesbian rule, which has its descendants in modern architecture. It's a flexible ruler so that if you want to measure the length of a corner or some elaborate molding, you can fit it into place. And so these are both interesting tools. I like the image of, differently than opening the case that holds your knuckle bones, you might open your toolkit if you're a certain kind of person in a certain kind of context, and encounter one or the other of both of these things with its peculiarity and specificity. Okay. Now we sort of scooped this topic a little bit in the discussion this morning. There are many metaphors or descriptions under which you can talk about money. You might talk about the background or the Cartesian coordinates against which you figure exchange. You might talk about a veil or a haze that obscures or distorts true reality. You might talk about a continuum, as Joel was earlier, or you might say that money is a set of relationships, as Richard were. All of these things, I think, are illuminating ways of thinking to bring to Aristotle. But what I propose is perhaps better than those, or what I want to attempt is thinking of money in Aristotle as one tool among others, an object with its specificity that opens up certain possibilities in the world, that links the capacities of its user, and the nature of the social environment around its user, and also that has certain kinds of features. And here you can see Aristotle comparing money in certain ways to a tool. The first quote talks about property in general. Any possession is a tool for maintaining life, and property in general is a collection plethos of such tools. And then he says specifically about nomisma, money makes things commensurate as a measure does. In the final days before this talk, I discovered a fascinating paper by Gwen Merkel, who's contributing the Xenophon paper to this volume. She has a great essay about about Protagoras' doctrine of man as the measure of all things, where she takes issue with Little and Scott and argues that contrary to what the dictionaries tell you, the primary meaning of measure, of metron, is not a measuring instrument, but something more abstract and conceptual. Anyway. So, money as one of your tools. Here's a first pass at conceiving how tools enter into our lives. You can think of them as one item in your repertoire among others. You can think of them as suited to particular objects. You can think of them as salient in certain situations. You can think of them as useful to users with certain competences or certain interests. You can think about the possibility of misuse of the tools. And finally, you can think of this idea of them making actions available that wouldn't otherwise be that way. So much by way of introduction. I had thought of saying a word or two about the texts. Maybe I can be very brief. Aristotle says less about money, I don't know, than he says about hoofed animals, much less than he says about friendship. And it's very clear that he doesn't treat economics as a science that deserves independent study. Rather, he drags his students past brief discussions of money on the ways to other destinations. One of the goals of this chapter is to try to take some of the famous passages that are often excerpted and see how they fit into broader arguments. A second point to make is that there are countless concise summaries of what Aristotle says about money, many of them incompatible with each other. The simplicity and confidence with which these are sometimes offered is matched only by the extreme consternation of specialized papers that write about this. Scott Michael's book on Aristotle on economics, I think it must use chaos and its cognates a dozen times in the introductory survey of the literature. Inamura returns again and again to what he calls the enigmatic passage, which somehow links the shoemaker and the farmer to their goods. And there's Moses Finley in a celebrated passage makes a big show of throwing up his hands and saying, "This is incomprehensible. I do not know what Aristotle proves." I too could start I can gnash my teeth a lot further about the messiness of the text. Okay, so I think the story here starts just where we started in the previous talk. I wanted to put up a digest of the first book of Xenophon's Economicus. The point is to get oriented with a general Socratic critique of the idea, not of money yet, but of wealth or property. So as the Economicus begins, Socrates asks a simple and sort of ambitious young Athenian what an oikos is, or I think a good translation is an estate. He says, is it just an oikia, a house? Critobulus takes the bait and says, no, it's more than that. It's everything a person has acquired in the fields, in the city, even in different cities. Aha! Socrates says, everything a person has acquired. Haven't some people acquired enemies? Is that really part of your estate? The more enemies you have, the more the wealthier are you. Critobulus says, no. He says, you only have possessions if they benefit you. Socrates says, what if you get on a horse and you can't ride it? What if you can't farm? And Critobulus goes where Socrates is leading and says, not even money, here it's argurion as well, unless you have the knowledge and virtue to use it properly. So you can see a lot going on in this chain of argument. It starts with a kind of simple and familiar moralism that would have been an easy pill to swallow, I think, for a Greek audience. Money isn't everything. It advances to this consideration of utility and benefit, which is, I I think, recognizable in modern economists of other of various stripes. And then it finds its way to a lofty discussion of virtue and the good that's characteristic of Socratic philosophy. And it's an argument that has echoes all through Plato. So, also worth noting maybe how this ranges across various things among one's possessions. We get different ways of thinking about what you have. Money is one of them. And here's the Midas quote. We talked about it a bit already. The point of the slide is to show Aristotle fully taking on board the Socratic position that we've got a problem explaining what wealth property is. It must not just be the stuff, the stuff in your storage closet, but it must be connected in some other way to your agency or to your identity or something like that. So these passages where it's hard to know if we're getting a metaphor or a set of conceptual tools or a literal account. But we do get, in one form or another, an account of what you might call primordial wealth or primordial property. And the simplest and clearest kind of property you might have is if you're a chick embryo, and there's food provided for you. This is the white of the egg, as I learned, there with you in the egg. So too, if you're an infant mammal, what wealth do you have? Before anything else, you have milk from your mother's breast. Okay. So maybe I won't read the passage. It's long enough that I elected not to put the Greek on the slide. But maybe I will point out that although Aristotle pitches this in the language of nature setting things up, with some intentionality, right? Nature gives animals what they need. Clearly what he's talking about is the way that animals are adapted to a certain environment. So chickens and other birds, in order for them to live and to reproduce, things need to be a certain way. And you can think about two sides to the way that things need to be for an animal. One is that their needs need to be met. So in this example, you might say that granted that the bird has to develop for 3 weeks inside, there better be some food in there. Aristotle says nature puts some food in there. What he means is that the nature of the chicken is set up so that the chicks don't perish before they hatch. And again, the way he puts it is that nature sets things up so animals have the capacity to use various things that are endowed to them. So young mammals don't have teeth, so they can't eat solid food, so they can only drink milk, so they better have lactase. I've departed from Aristotle's example. And all of this is a matter of the needs and capacities of the animals. I think it is highly useful to apply this model to the way Aristotle thinks about human tools. When it comes to human beings, the capacity will be a matter of knowledge or skill, not just natural ability, but the same kind of reasoning. I'll say something more about that, but I'd like to, before that, look at one other kind of property that Aristotle talks about in the run-up to the famous discussion of money in Politics 1. Maybe I'll say this is one of the moments in Aristotle where you can see how it would have been for him teaching in the Lyceum. Early in the Politics, he very grudgingly and eye-rollingly says, I'm going to talk about household management. I know you guys are going to want to talk about wealth acquisition, chromastice. Fine, we'll get there. And it's all hedged, but some people say that chromastice is part of economicae and so on. But by the time he gets to the discussion proper, he's excited to do it. because he has used the idea of slavery to reimagine just what property can be, how dynamic it can be, and how it can be articulated not just with production, but with action. So depending on what you've been reading, this is fairly familiar stuff. He says slaves are living tools. He says they're, as it were, a part of their master's bodies. They're meta tools, that is, tools which use other of your tools, and they're tools that are used for action, not merely for production. Yeah. And here's where he makes the transition to talking about money as such. He says, since the slave has turned out to be a part of property, let's now study property and wealth acquisition generally, following the path that this guy gives. And here we've got maybe one of the best known parts of Aristotle's treatment of money. I want to make short work of it. I wasn't sure where to place it in the discussion. But before we talk about what kind of tool money is for Aristotle, it's useful to talk maybe, or perhaps we might as well discuss some of the ways that he thinks it can be misused, the ways he thinks it's a bad tool or a tool that can hurt you if you're not equipped to use it properly. He says there are two ways of acquiring wealth. One has to do with commerce, kapelike, the other with household management. One kind is necessary and commendable. And I think the analogy with the chick embryo helps to show what he means by that. Human beings have certain needs, we have certain capacities. Granted the kinds of animals we are, we may want to turn one possession into another. The word is alage, which literally just means changing things. People will often, the standard translation is exchange, which maybe has more heavier implications than you want. It's sometimes translated as barter, which implies a lot. To me, it makes sense to, when he talks about alage, I think he's mainly imagining something quite continuous with gift-giving reciprocity, like you'll find as far back as Homer. The type of animals we are animals that have some things, and soon enough we give and take so that they change. Okay. So it's perfectly good that we change one of our possessions to another by exchanging it or trading it with someone else. It's perfectly natural and good that we have this tool, money, which allows us to change one commodity to another. It starts to become questionable if we start out with money and we try to use commodities to acquire more and different money. And what he thinks is certainly out of bounds is lending money at interest. So trying to change money into more money, that he thinks is not related in the proper ways to our needs and our capacities. He famously says it's unlimited and rules it out. Okay. All right. So what kind of a tool is money? One way to answer that question is by looking at these brief comments about the origins of coinage. And these passages become celebrated because Aristotle singles out various functions of money that would become important in monetary theories of other kinds later on. Its portability and its use in like long distance exchange is important. Not all of the natural necessities are easily transportable. So the use of money had of necessity to be devised, he says. And he says, at first, its value is determined simply by size and weight. But then people put a stamp on it, saving themselves the trouble of having to measure it. He says later on in another passage we'll look at that in fact it's entirely conventional and we can change it however we like. But here, as just about everywhere else, you can see Aristotle thinking about how human beings are connected to the specificity of their environment, in a way that helps them meet their needs, that expresses and takes advantage of their capacities, and that moves around in light of the limitations. But I think for Aristotle, coinage is by no means what money really is. I also have on the slide, so I'll say a reference to the bios way of life that's associated with using a tool in a certain way. There's an interesting analogy between carnivores and herbivores, animals that are affixed to a certain way of life because of their natural capacities, and then an argument about different human bioi that are determined by our relationship to food or ultimately to money. So for Aristotle, the development of coinage appears to be important, but really what he seems to think but money is not primarily a transportable object or a commodity, but a way of measuring things and talking about the relationships. So he says exchange goods must all be measured by some one thing. And it's true that he said this before. In fact, this passage from either the Nicomachean or the Eudemian ethics is riddled with so-called doubles, where he seems to have been writing the same thing in different ways and trying it over and over again. In any case, he says, need binds everything together. This is sometimes Kreta is sometimes translated demand. We can talk about that possible translation if you'd like. He says if people neither needed things nor needed them to a similar extent, either there would be no exchange or not the same one. But as a sort of exchangeable representative of need, money came into existence on the basis of convention, and it's called money, nomisma, because of that, because it exists not by nature, but by conventional law, and changing it or rendering it useless is up to us. So there are very interesting connections to the question of refiguring the currency that we were talking about. One thing I wanted to emphasize here is that we have not traveled too far from the question of lactation or infant nutrition. So at a certain stage in the young animal's life, it finds itself needing certain things. It's difficult for it to get those things. And so it's equipped, or it equips itself to get them otherwise. And that's what money is. Okay. But how does it do it? So at this point, I'm going to leave behind the comparatively simple discussion of Politics 189 and look at what he says about money in a very brief and very difficult and fascinating passage in either the Nicomachean Ethics or the Eudemian Ethics. Perhaps I should point out that a few serious scholars, like none less than Malcolm Schofield, have some doubts about whether it's even really Aristotle who says this. But in any case, I think there are three things that kill this. So first, it measures the value of goods, making them commensurable. Second, money facilitates enduring reciprocity and gratitude. And third, it equalizes unequal people. And there's a lot to be said about what each of those mean and how they're interrelated. Okay. So I think the simplest for a modern reader is this idea of making unlike goods commensurable. If the shoemaker has shoes and the builder has a house, how on earth would you figure out how many shoes are equivalent to one house? It's a difficult question. Somehow we do it. And Aristotle says that somehow is by affixing a price. The house maybe costs $100,000 and the shoes cost $30,000. So money measures everything. It measures excess and deficiency, and how many shoes are equal to a house. Joel K. will recognize that I've shamelessly stolen these diagrams from the cover of his book. There's an amazing discussion there, but I'm not sure if we'll hear a version of it later on. This diagram of the square, I understand, caught fire in the Middle Ages. It was appeared as the only illustration in otherwise illustration-free books. What's important about it is that instead of a line between two objects, you get a square linking four objects. So whatever money does, it's essential that it doesn't just do it to the shoes in the house. It also does things to the people surrounding the shoes in the house. So I'll read the quotation. Proportionate reciprocity keeps a city together. For people either seek to return evil for evil or good for good. But it's through mutual giving that they keep together. The language here is very much, the language here is not at all necessarily commercial. It's the language of gift giving and gift and receiving, or it's indeterminate how you're getting giving and taking things. But in any case, what money does is ensure that this kind of reciprocity is possible. And so whatever's happening, I'm not sure in these dialogues, are the shoes in the house at the bottom of the square? Do we know where they're located?
Sometimes.
All right.
I think they're fairly consistent. A, B, G, and D.
Okay.
Fairly consistent.
Yeah. Well, in any case, they almost drop out of the picture in any of these discussions. What money does is really people. And in one of the few evocative and sort of aesthetically captivating passages in what's otherwise just an intractable sort of quasi-mathematical text, Aristotle evokes what it's like to walk down to the Agora and see the statues of the great. This is a 3rd century BCE image, for which I apologize. But to help you picture what reciprocity is and why it's so important and why therefore money is going to prove so important, he writes this. He says, that's why cities erect the temple of the graces, that's the caritas, in a conspicuous place, in order that there might be a return for what's given. For this is the special characteristic of gratitude. We should not only do a service in return for someone who has done us a favor, but on another occasion, start by doing a favor too. This passage, I think, is especially important to me because in contemporary ways of thinking about market exchanges, they're one-off events. Typically, when you think about using money, you might not think that once you've purchased something and the transaction's concluded, someone has to go out of their way to initiate another transaction. Your community doesn't fall apart. But Aristotle is only talking about money here because reciprocity is so important, and reciprocity is only going to work if it's enduring, if one transaction has a way of bringing about another, so that the community endures and we can build together. So the story so far is that you've got a kind of tool that's more a conceptual tool than a physical one. What it acts on in the immediate term is sets of objects, making them commensurate with each other. And it just does that in order to secure the relationships of the human beings around it. And then there's one more factor to bring into the equation, which is that when money is at work, this verb appears many times through the passage. When money is at work, people are getting equalized. I think people talk a lot about Aristotle on equality. They don't notice enough how often he uses verbal forms of the word rather than the noun usates. Equality is not something that he imagines fellow citizens in a polis as having from the beginning. He imagines it as something that's created through a certain kind of social activity, including market exchange. What exactly does equalization involve? Well, if you'll forgive me, I'll take one more step back and contrast this idea of reciprocity with other forms of justice that he discusses. Many accounts of this material traipse through Aristotle's 3, or perhaps there are just 2, but one of them is divided into 2 forms of justice. I think often people overlook how emphatic Aristotle is that the primary form of justice, from which all the others are derived, is what he calls distribution according to equality of proportions. Okay. And what that involves is that the best people get the most goods and the best goods, and that the worst people get the worst. The word equality is really important here. Aristotle is building on a long tradition of anti-democratic rhetoric. By the time he's writing, it had become widely accepted that equality was a hallmark of Athens and a hallmark of good politics. In all kinds of texts, including Thucydides' funeral orations and many others, it's all over Plato too, you find people trying to explain it away. He says, yes, equality is important, but let's not make the mistake of imagining people are equal to each other. Rather, what's equal is the proportion formed by what someone receives and his own value. So the paradigm case is after a war raid, Achilles will get a magnificent tripod, or more likely a certain kind of slave, as in this illustration with Briseis. And a shabbier warrior will get, a little bit of bronze garbage. And that's how you secure equality for Aristotle. So there's another kind of equalization that shows up in Aristotle's discussion of restorative justice. Happy to talk about it during the question period, but maybe I'll skip it. But I thought it would be good to show at least one more passage where you see this kind of equalization at work. This is in his discussion of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. He's puzzling about how to make it work when you're friends with someone and one person is better than the other. And the answer is the better person loves less and the inferior person loves more, and equality is achieved. All right. So here's the passage that Ian Moore calls the Enigmatic Passage. This is the passage that Finley says, I frankly don't understand it. And it's the sequel to one of the passages we've seen before. He says, how do you find equality between the shoes and the house? Here's what you got to do. Just as a builder is to a shoemaker, then so such and such a number of shoes must be to house or to food. For if this does not happen, there will be no exchange and no community. The argument, I think there's no way around it, is that money and exchange has to address in some way and preserve the inequalities of people. So I did some research and didn't find much information. I assume a builder has a higher status than a shoemaker. I'm not sure if anyone knows texts that bear on that. But on that assumption, you'd want to make sure that the builder got a better deal and perhaps got a better share of honor thereby. And that would equalize them, making sure. And this, I should say there are many decades at least. Others in the room can tell me if there are perhaps centuries, but there are at least decades of people arguing about what this passage could be. There's a distinguished tradition passing through Joachim and Finley and the Stephen Ike paper that Graham mentioned earlier makes a version of this case, saying clearly reciprocal monetary exchange for Aristotle has got to subordinate the subordinate and elevate the lofty. There's another counter tradition saying that doesn't make any sense. But I think it's clear what the text says. All right. So I'll close by talking about how Aristotle imagines this happening in practice, and some of the ways he thinks about ensuring, as it were, the safe use of money in the city. This is a passage from Politics 7, where he's imagining the city of our prayers and comparing it in some detail implicit to the Athenian city. And what he suggests is separating two markets. So the free market is one that is suitable for free people. So it's kept clear of wares. No workers or farmers or anyone else of that sort can enter unless summoned by officials. And the idea seems to be that it's a highly regimented kind of agora that ensures that there is the minimal possible amount of social mixing, haggling, and other kinds of fraught social relationship, the kind of thing that characterized the agora in Athens. Reading this, I think it's useful to keep in mind. There's a passage from Pseudo-Xenophon where he complains that in the agora in Athens, things have gotten so bad you can't tell the free people from the slaves. They're all just milling about in the market, interacting with each other as if that were fine. This is a mechanism for preventing that. Meanwhile, there is a market that looks more like the agora, possibly modeled on how things would be down by the Piraeus, where there's more international trade, as you might call it. It seems that money was especially widely used in exchanges with other poleis, which is just what's suggested by that origin of coinage story, is saying that coins only really became necessary when you weren't interacting with fellow citizens with whom you want to ensure reciprocity, but distant foreigners. So this is a concluding slide that tries to lay out the logic within which Aristotle places his treatment of money. Perhaps the assumption that serves as ground zero here is that human beings need community, just as embryonic animals need nutrition. Aristotle thinks exchange or changing the moving about of goods is necessary for community. And then we've got a more sociological or historically precise argument saying under present community conditions, I apologize for the typo, our communities involve a great deal of mixing of unequal people and trade with other cities. And his argument is ultimately that money is a tool for assessing the value of heterogeneous things and permitting fruitful and generative association, if you want, under these particular kinds of circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was really helpful. I think the slavery thing is really, really important here. And it even the Delphian knife quote at the beginning is like, it's an aside while talking about natural slavery, right? So, and what you were saying there about the end about the unequal exchange and the unequal relations between persons, like that's what you use your slaves to do. You use them to go do proxy stuff. So I'm wondering if, to lack a better way of saying it, for Aristotle, enslaved persons are the knuckle bones for talking about money. right? Like there's most of the passages you are quoting, he's also talking about slavery. And I saw that as a big theme for you, but I just wondered if you could think some more about that.
Good, yeah, thank you. I agree with everything you said. I've thought about that a bunch. One idea that's caught my imagination, and I haven't been sure what to say about it in general or in this paper, is that Aristotle makes this lovely distinction between use value and exchange value. But enslaved people have a very fun, because they're, on the one hand, the people who are doing a great deal of the, as you said, commercial exchange, and also objects
Yes,
in the market. So I don't.
Yeah, no, I think you're I think that is something there, because like that is how a lot of scholars of ancient slavery like are dealing with that tension about people as objects and people, and also like tools of exchange. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts earlier about what to do in the chapter?
No, I'm not sure how else. I just was like noting that like it seems like you have it as a section, and I'm like, it's a section where I also see it popping up in then other sections of URL. So I don't have the answer, but.
And on the question of what you do, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because so much of this stuff is so obscure and ambivalent, and as you said, endlessly debated. I don't see how you can avoid taking position on some of these big issues, even if you don't provide much argumentation. I mean, this is completely baffling text, isn't it? What does this mean? And this is a real, just my curiosity, but I think it can lead to bigger issues. For it may happen that the product of one of the parties is worth more than that of the other, and in that case, therefore, they have to be equalized. I mean, you've broached this topic. What does that mean? I mean, give me an example of that. You've got a builder and a shoemaker, and the product of the builder or the shoemaker is worth more than the product of the other person. Give me concrete detail on that. What does that mean?
Yeah. So before I answer, one difficulty with that passage is that the Greek there for product is ergon.
Yeah.
So some people translate it to labor.
Yeah, it's not the labor theory of value, no.
But some people imagine that it is.
How is the they translate? The they need to be.
You said
tutus. You have the Greek, yeah, it's tutus.
Oh, the tutus de isasthene, but these, which is the people. Wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, I think I might have got the wrong passage here. It may happen that one of the, so that's a different passage, because he uses isasthene to be made equal both of the products and of the people.
Exactly.
And I'll get the word. If you continue the discussion, I shall find the word.
Yeah, it's just super quickly to go with that. A builder and a shoemaker are both likely to be enslaved persons as well. Like, right, like we're talking about like day laborer type people. So you're not the household manager if you're doing either of those things. So we might be talking about two elite household managers talking about the labor value of their two.
Or we might be thinking really much more about equalizing the goods rather than equalizing the people. Because, I mean, the Latins understood it as equalizing the goods more than equalizing the people. Now, the last thing I want to do is underestimate the importance of the power of slavery in this culture, the power of a huge hierarchy of status. But it seems to me that it's the idea, when he wants to talk about proportional reward, he talks about the city. The city is going to reward, the city has, this is a thinking body, not an exchange, not between kind of a random or chance thing that with chances involved. The city will give the general much greater reward than it will give, the good policeman, so and so and so and so. And he says that's supposed to be the way it is. Because if the city gives the same reward to the high status person and the low status person, that's actually unjust. And he makes that point very clear. But he doesn't make that point with the goods. he doesn't make the point that you're making, which is, you're making very strongly, which is the one thing I take exception to. Everything else makes perfect sense to me. But medieval scholars understood that it's good, and somehow, Richard raises the question, well, how, that's what money does. Money makes it clear that it's this continuum of value, so that you can divide the continuum of value rather than dividing the house into 5. Let's say a house is worth 5 pairs of shoes, or 5 beds is one of its examples. He said it's money that gets divided, not the goods, to equalize them. I mean, that's what we do. That's how we do it.
By the way, the word for these is these things, neuter.
Oh, good.
Oh, okay.
Good.
Right. But then he has these 2 passages, one about equalizing the type of these things, which must be the goods, and the other about equalizing the people, where he uses the same pronoun, but in the masculine plural, these people.
Right.
But I mean, what you said makes me want to really go back again to my question. How do you envisage this? Give me an example of this equalization of the goods and this equalization of the people. What's happening here? Because it's not clear.
Yeah. So again, I can give 2. One simplistic, and the other gesturing at something a bit more realistic. I mean, a simple one, I think the idea would be, suppose we all know. Yeah, I mean, suppose we all evaluate houses and shoes about the way we do. And suppose we agree that a house builder is of considerably higher status than a shoemaker. Then you'd have some sort of deal where a house comes out, worth a dozen pairs of shoes.
Yes.
The status inequality, and so in other words, the shoemaker gets a terrible deal. Honor or victory accrues to the builder, and their relationship can continue.
Okay, but so I think I really disagree with that interpretation. I think I do. I'm not sure. But how does it work then? The house builder provides a house, and the shoemaker provides 10 pairs of shoes. Now, these are clearly unequal. And this is the situation he seems to be talking about. You need a lot more than 10 pairs of shoes if you're going to have an equal.
I think it's a house and a bed. So,
okay,
I mean, it's true. It's very unequal.
Yeah, I know.
His point clearly is that the builder does not need 5 beds. So that can't be the exchange. Somehow there's got to be a continuum that both are related to.
Well, that's not. I agree about that. Okay. That's not quite the point I'm making.
Okay.
The point I'm making is whatever the goods that are being involved in, whether it's a house, a barrel, a bonnet, whatever it is, he's given a situation and where these things are of unequal value and they have to be equalized. See, I think it means this is what happens in a commercial exchange. You have to equalize the value of the olive oil on the one hand,
Precisely,
and the shoes on the other. That has nothing to do with the status. This is where I differ. That doesn't have to do with the status of the olive oil producer and the shoemaker.
Yeah.
See, that you're making that the starting point. I don't think that's actually, I might be wrong because I haven't looked at this passage for a long time. I don't think that's what Aristotle is talking about. He's saying there is this stuff that are unequal, and any commercial exchange requires this equality of value. And then he says, as Joel points out, well, it's money that makes them commensurable. No, he's wrong about that. Money can't make them commensurable, because if they're incommensurable, a measure is not going to make them commensurable.
Yeah.
And that's why he gives it up and goes for Crea need instead, which need is expressed by money.
precisely, which is absolutely. I mean, the goods are basically going to be equated through money, and they're not going to be equated in themselves because money can't measure natures in themselves. They're going to be equated through their value that they have through how much they're needed.
But what he can't do is to explain, well, that's really what happens.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happens in the commercial exchange. Perfectly good analysis. But what he isn't doing is explaining the basis for the commensurability.
Yeah.
How is it that 3 barrels of olive oil equals 4 beds. That's a complete mystery, which he does not solve.
Yeah.
Prayer, so okay, it's prayer, it's need. Prayer, it's not quantifiable.
But tell me something.
So Justin has been.
Yes, yes.
Handwritten.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah, thank you for letting me jump in. And thank you, Zoli, for the very interesting talk. And I had my mic shut off before, but indeed, it's nice to see you after all these years. So I was just going to add something to an earlier comment, and it was the first one about slavery. And I apologize, I don't know your name. But I've also been struck in the politics in particular by the relationship or the contiguity of the discussion of money and of enslaved people, almost to the extent that it seems like the same topic. Now, I'm particularly struck by what you said, and something I'd never noticed before about Aristotle on slavery, the significance of what you cited, the line where Aristotle says that slaves are practically a continuation of their owner. And this strikes me in relation to some work I've been doing on, sorry about bringing up my own people, but Leibniz and a treatise he wrote on slavery in 1701, where he compares it to parenthood, and he also describes the relationship of the parent to child, in particular of the mother to child, as kind of the ultimate form of human domination, because you start out literally as the same body, and then you become merely dependent, but you can walk away, and then eventually you have to, so to speak, walk away altogether. And Leibniz says that this is the model of any domination of any human being by any other that must serve to ground such domination in justice. Slavery can't provide that, and the implicit view therefore seems to be that slavery is necessarily unjust, at least in this world, even if there are some conceivable versions of it where it's just. So to bring this back to Aristotle, when Aristotle says that the slave is as if an extension of the body of the master, is this to say that the slave is distinct from the other property that the slaveholder owns, that there's a categorical difference that makes a slave different from a pair of shoes or an ox cart or something like that, such that it's either he or she is either more comparable to the ideal sort of abstract object of exchange or less? Does it imply a moral dimension in your view? What is the significance of that observation, in particular in relationship to money?
Yeah. So it's a mysterious passage. I think one part of the significance for me is to hammer home the teleological relationship between the two. I mean, the Delphic knife passage, as people know, is about how you can't, he says, like as the Persians supposedly do, use the same person to speak in this terrible way with that, to use the same person as your wife and as your slave. He says, no, they're different sorts of people and they need to be ruled differently. And so what that difference amounts to is that in a married relationship, he thinks the husband should rule the wife with an eye to the good of the whole. But in a master-slave relationship, the enslaved person, he says, ought to be ruled wholly in the interests of the master. If good, he thinks, thankfully some good accrues to the enslaved person, but that should be no part of the master's liberation.
Could I protest? You had a lovely consensus this morning. Now I'm asking these are real differences. Because as far as I can see, and if you've got a passage to refute this, I'll withdraw it immediately. But as far as I can see, the question of status of the producers does not enter into the question of the construction of equality. If a slave produces loads of shoes and a free man produces loads of shoes, the slave's shoes, the shoes produced by the slave are not worth more or less, not worth less than the shoes produced by the free man. And somebody with a builder and a shoemaker, you seem to be interested in the question of which of them had a greater status. I don't think Aristotle is interested in that. What he's interested is in the fact that these shoes, whether they're produced by a slave or a free man, or as a hobby by Pericles himself, they're still have to be equalized. There's a process of equalization which is at the heart of commercial exchange, and the status of the producers, what you call this proportionate reciprocity. I'm suggesting provocatively, and I say I might be wrong, that it has nothing to do with this process of equalization. He doesn't relate to state, he relates it to two things: money and krea, which means need. He doesn't relate it to status.
So how do you read this passage that I put up here? As the builder is to the shoemaker. What's that relationship between them? So too must be the shoe slabs.
The difference is the builder has more skill. The difference is the builder has more expenses. The difference is the builder has, I mean, the essential problem of the analysis is that he's not thinking of a market. You have exchange between two people, and money is the instrument of exchange between two people, which it rarely is. And it's, of course, the 13th century that recognizes that it's really common value, common need, indigentia communis, that is really what's being measured by money. And that's the missing piece that Aristotle just doesn't have, because he doesn't extend it to a market exchange. He extends it only to exchange between two people. Still, their need has to be somehow equalized. That 3 liters of olive oil has got to be somehow equalized with those beds.
But he says, including this discussion, he sort of gives up on money as the explanation of equalization. And then he says, well, it's need. Clear. But then eventually he says, well, actually, in effect, says that doesn't work either. He said it works roughly. He says it doesn't actually solve the problem, because he's an intelligent man. You can see he hasn't really solved the problem of how these things are commensurable. A Marxist would say that's because he doesn't have a labor theory of value. But he says it's good enough. For practical purposes, we'll just say that it is need expressed in the numerical value of money that does the job.
Both exchangers have to feel good at the end of that exchange. Yeah. Otherwise, they're not going to exchange. Yeah. And the city will fall apart.
So he's got all that stuff right. Yeah. It's very important to register that status is not what explains the inequality and therefore the need to equalize. Yeah. And it's also very important to register that he doesn't really solve the problem.
No.
I think that's basically right, but the problem here is that he just flat out does not have a theory of where the value of exchange value.
Yeah, he's a bit of a pioneer.
But he does have a theory of where the value in distributive justice comes from. Yeah. If you want to know who deserves the big reward and who deserves a small reward, read the ethics, read the politics. Right? He's going to explain to you how you differentiate the value of persons within the polis.
Yeah, right. I think that this is
I think one of the things that's maybe going on in this passage here is that, conceptually he has things that, but because he has a theory of one but not a theory of the other, the theory that he has leaks into the theory that he doesn't have.
Yeah, indeed. And this, I would say, in addition to what Joel said quite rightly about this passage, I would say this passage is a bit of an expression of his aporia, of his inability to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. He's saying, just as a builder is to, people say, this is so vague. What on earth does it mean? And that's because it doesn't really get to grips with the issue, which is one of equalization. What does it mean to say, just as a builder is to a shoemaker? He doesn't say status. He doesn't have that word in the text. It's a sort of geometrical thing.
But his line sort of automatically turns, I think, to status. I think, and sort of like as a devotee of the old Finley debate, I mean, I feel like this tells us something about ancient society.
Well, it does.
The market value was inconceivable. When they thought of value, they just, even if they knew it wasn't right, they think of status value.
Or there's social reasons, political reasons for them not to want to think about it.
Yeah.
Not that they can't think about it or they don't know about it, but I think he intentionally makes it between two people, and personalizes it in a way that doesn't make, in the end.
Of course, when the scholastics pick up this problem, right?
Yeah,
They
liked it.
but they also, what they wind up saying, right, is that there is a full art
Well,
of determining exchange value, which is an art which is held by mercatores and
Oh, yeah.
expressive narratives of the marketplace.
as Joel shows, scholastics actually draw diagrams and, in the margins of text. But Aristotle does mention geometry, but it's pretty peripheral. I mean, he says, oh, by the way, as in brackets, as it were, this is like what the geometricians say. He's not saying, by the way, this can all be expressed in a diagram. He's saying, quite very acutely, that there's an analogy between, it's similar to what the geometricians do. But in this particular passage, again, I think it's a fascinating passage, because he's desperate to find the basis of equalization. He thinks he can't rely on the goods themselves. I mean, what does that mean, So he must rely on the producers, must be based on the producers of the goods. But he doesn't explain how that works. Joel suggests it might be labor, skill, and so on. And indeed, those things are irrelevant. I don't think status is nearly as relevant as those things, though neither of them are actually expressed. We're just left to guess, because, as I say, he's a pioneer in this,
But he does think there's this art of grammatistike, whatever that is. But that does, and I don't know, I haven't looked over the passage very recently, but I think that's a different thing, right, than determining exchange value in the marketplace. Grammatistike is it's basically usury, right? It's knowing how to.
I mean, he uses it, senses, one of which is usury, yeah.
So the lore about the Socratics in Sicily compares the price of things in the Agora at Athens versus their price in Sicily. So is that not a marketplace?
Absolutely.
That's an arbitrage opportunity.
Absolutely, and we do it again, there's a forum, they talk about the Bruges market versus the Parisian market, in their commentary.
So it's not anachronistic for Aristotle, it's just.
I don't think it is. I mean,
how could
it be? He doesn't once mention the word price or anything like price.
There's a line where he says prices fluctuate a little.
Does he say prices?
I don't remember what the Greek is.
Well, there are two words in
I don't
Greek
think
which
he
are
said
relevant to
price.
this. One is time, which is still the Greek word for price, which basically means honor. Now that's an interesting development. And the other is axia, which means worth, which isn't the same thing as
Yeah,
price.
it's not the same.
So there's no precise translation of price, but time would be the closest.
Yeah.
May I suggest an interpretation of this in economic terminology? Sure. I'm putting on the economist hat. I'm a trained economist. It seems like he's saying, I may be wrong, it seems like he's saying that we have to get the relative prices right. If we don't get the relative prices right, then there isn't an equilibrium and exchange won't take place.
Yeah.
And obviously, one pair of shoes per house, that's not an equilibrium relative price. Perhaps it's, 5,000 pairs of shoes to a house is possible, but 1-to-1 is not an equilibrium and there won't be exchange if that's the relative price. So there has to be some way of getting the relative prices right. He doesn't say what it is, whether it's free markets, whether it's some kind of regulation or administrative apparatus, but if we don't get relative prices right, then there won't be exchange and there won't be community.
That's exactly right, but 5,000 shoes, I mean, no, that's not right. Let's say,
Just throwing out a number.
no, it doesn't matter what the number is. Who needs 5,000 pairs of shoes? That's why you have money. That's his point.
And also, I mean, sorry to go back to the thing about status, but it's
That's what makes that's what relativizes the values in some kind of workable way. Instead of multiplying the numbers of shoes you're going to exchange for this house, Now, the house is
Double
the
coincidence.
house is worth so and so much, and the shoe is worth so and so much. And, you know, everybody knows what the, again, he doesn't talk about a market price.
Yeah, I mean, the vocabulary he's using, which is a good guide to his preconceptions, don't involve that kind of consideration. Then we can look at it and say, well, this kind of consideration lies, but I don't think it's what Aristotle is doing. I mean, he's faced with this astonishing phenomenon in which 2 barrels of olive oil equals 7 pairs of shoes. Now, and they're equal. Moreover, and this is really important, it isn't often said about this passage, it is a fact in commercial exchange, and it was a fact in ancient commercial exchange, that if you said to somebody, I normally sell these for 4 drachmas, but because I'm an aristocrat and richer, I'm going to charge you, and you're not an aristocrat, I'm going to charge you more for it. That is to say, it's in a world in which there's so much gradation of social status. You know, everybody has a social status. Men have a different status from women, slaves from free men, rich from poor, noble blood from non-noble blood. The whole thing is a tissue of social statuses, and yet nobody says, by the way, you're a woman, so I'm going to charge you more for this.
Precisely. And that's why.
So I mean, Paul Millet has this incredible paper where he draws on Theophrastus's characters to get a sense of how things actually worked in the Agora. And this is something I considered doing a slide of, and now I don't have it at my fingertips. But there's one, he gives a portrait of something like the petty greedy man, and then gives this incredible detailed narrative of how the haggling would go in the marketplace.
Yeah.
So he shows up and he asks for the nicest piece of meat, and the merchant refuses, and then he grabs a ladle full of soup on the way out. And I think like those mechanisms will say something about how this would play out and how the price was in fact fixed in ancient.
Indeed. Yeah, and it's interesting that 5 of Theophrastus's characters are all like this in one way or another. They're all mean and haggling and so on. And when they go into the marketplace, they don't say, I'm not going to pay 5 drachmas for this fish because I'm more important than you are. They say, I'm not going to pay 5 drachmas for this fish because it's a really bad fish. Right? It's all about the goods. It's not about this thing. But this is an astonishing development in human history. That there should be this equality between goods and equality between people. And that is, it seems to me, is a stunning thing which Aristotle wants to explain, but unsurprisingly doesn't really manage to do so.
Yeah, I mean, Gabriel has a good.
Why is it astonishing?
Because
I'll tell you why it wouldn't work. A person wouldn't be able to do that. Because somebody who discriminates, let's say, wants to overcharge someone because the buyer has a lower social status. So if there's a large market, many sellers, who needs you? I'll go and buy from someone who doesn't discriminate.
Absolutely. That's how it works.
Why is that such a revolutionary idea?
It just is.
I mean, it seems like common sense.
It is common sense. I mean, all this stuff seems like common sense to us. But if you read about the pre-monetary society of Homer, nobody ever takes that view, ever. It's just completely alien. And Homer gives you a very detailed conception of society with all sorts of transactions going on. Exchange, distribution, sacrifice, gift exchange, and all the rest of it. Nobody ever, commercial exchange is represented occasionally, but there's nothing of this sort of thing. On the whole, people relate to each other economically on the basis of differential power and status. That's how they relate to it. They don't relate to each other economically on the basis of the idea that goods should be equal in value. That comes with money. I mean, you might say it comes with barter, but there isn't really any barter or very little barter in Homer, and some people think there never was any barter anyway. So it's common sense, but that what is completely novel, stunningly novel, and needs explanation in one era can just look, from then on, just looks like common sense. It's certainly common sense to us, but historical imagination requires you to imagine a world in which it's really surprising in a sense. Or at least, perhaps I've chosen the wrong word. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps surprising or astonishing is the wrong word. But it is a big contrast with traditional relationships in which economic power resides in the status of the person rather than the quality and quantity of the goods.
But in India, the caste system.
Yeah, what
Do you
about
see
it?
higher prices being charged to people of lower castes?
Do you?
I don't know.
That's a very good
Is there any
question.
society, caste society, where you see differential prices? Price discrimination, if you call that price discrimination. It's not
I think,
actually not price discrimination.
Maybe just the
I
opposite.
think, yeah, you don't, because it's not a price system. I mean, what you have in India is a situation in which the Brahmins are screwing the lower orders, you know? I mean, that is on the basis
In
of
different ways, not
in
just.
different ways, but that's precisely what I'm talking about, is where, I mean, India becomes monetized in the 6th and 5th century. I've written a book about it, but in the early period of this, you can see that this whole metaphysical structure arises out of the necessity of sacrificing, and in that way the Brahmins get a lot of money. It's a metaphysical religious duty. It's got nothing to do with the fair idea of a fair price or anything like that. That is a good question about whether, what the economic dealings are with the lower castes. And it might be an interesting study of contemporary India as well as ancient India. I don't know any evidence to suggest that once you've got a commercial society, as you did in India, sometime after the period I wrote my book about, then I don't know any evidence to suggest that that commercial principle of the equality of people, the equality of goods, in the commercial exchange is breached. Because a caste system is a good example, because here are people who are essentially different from each other. They're metaphysically different. However, they may well, nevertheless, when it comes to exchange, operate as equal operators. And Buddhism, which emerges in the 5th, 4th century BC, along with monetization, I think is probably an expression of that. And karma is an expression of that, in which anybody can, Buddhism transcends the caste system and creates this world of metempsychosis and circulation of souls, which I've argued in great detail is an expression of the new monetary system. So that's all very complex in India. Yeah.
I just want to say that Sajat Ray, in a couple of his movies, the one masterpiece called The Middleman, talks about what's happening to his culture in the 50s as it becomes more commercialized. And as Brahmins lose their status in terms of how much money they have instead of their social status. And it's jarring. I mean, it becomes almost the world is changing because this new reality has now it's not that it was never there and it's all of a sudden there. It's to say that its power has grown to the point where it is trumping, this kind of equalization is trumping the status, hierarchical status of society. And it's really powerful. I mean, we didn't grow up with that. We grew up. But imagine, I mean, in
It's all
America,
over
right?
literature. It's all over European literature.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then, about aristocratic families. In the 19th century novel, it's almost its main theme
Yeah.
is the
leopard. Think of the leopard or.
The leopard, exactly, and Chekhov and Tolstoy and George Eliot. It's so much of it is about this basic conflict between new money and old blood.
New values and all that.
Yeah.
I have a question, moving away from the market and back to to distributive justice. Do you think that Aristotle was conceiving that if the Achaeans had known about money and had been able to quantify that way, that the entire unfortunate episode of the Iliad might have been avoided because they could have made it clear that each was in fact being rewarded according to his virtue?
Yeah, I mean, it's dead on, absolutely a perfect point, because it's
I kind of think the answer is yes, but I also think that's an absolutely insane view.
well, look, Achilles says in Book 9, they come to Achilles from Agamemnon, they say, we want you to rejoin the army, and this will solve this breach in the Greek army. And we're going to offer you this vast amount of stuff, towns, a few nice young women, all the rest of it. It's a huge amount of stuff. And Achilles says, no, I'm not going to do that. It doesn't matter how much you offer me, because it's not going to compensate for the damage done to the pain I've suffered because of this. Now, this is this, and similarly at the end of the Odyssey, the suitors offer compensation, which Odysseus rejects, and he kills the suitors. This is exactly the situation that in which one of the sources of money becomes kind of obvious, that if there are fixed penalties, like the earliest Greek law codes have fixed penalties for offences. If you had a fixed penalty in the Iliad, then the whole thing would have been solved. So money would have done the job.
If they had fixed monetary values for all of the loot, and then a fixed set, a fixed tariff for who gets how much, which in fact, like, could they do this in medieval and early modern armies?
If we go back to India, I read the story recently, and more than once, where the deal was made, the bride price was paid, and the agreement was that the bride's family, I actually can't remember whether it's the groom's family or the bride's family, would give the other family a car and a refrigerator and an oven and so on. So no, that was the deal. That was very frank and very so and so. But it turns out that one family was very disappointed with the kind of car, and they killed the wife.
Although of course there's still.
Murdered the wife.
But you would say that they canceled the wedding.
No, I mean, seriously, it's not coming out of my mind, it's a story that I really had.
And that was legal, it wasn't punished.
It's illegal.
Can't remember, it's very illegal, but it
Maybe they know.
It's apparently a big problem. But the fact of the matter is, doing it in terms of money doesn't help. Because then they argue about whether it's actually been paid off and it's been done in a timely manner.
Genuinely it helps.
But maybe
This is how the polis was constituted, it's agreement on penalty.
You know about Virgils and all that, in grammatic code.
Yeah.
Who? Virgil? So the.
Oh, Virgil, yeah, it was Grierson.
Yes.
It was Grierson's theory, there was a mother egg Virgil.
Yeah.
And David Graeber takes it up.
Yeah.
Shall we go out in search of coffee?
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you.